Well, one down and one to go. Shabbat Shalom. Israel's fifth national election in 4 years is over, and we can now know for certain that Bibi Netanyahu will become once again Prime Minister of Israel. But please note this. His most significant supporters in this go-round are partners in the suddenly, dramatically powerful ultra-right-wing party known as Religious Zionism. Their names, the two guys, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich. You might never have heard of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich before, but a word to the wise, become familiar with those names and with those men. If they succeed in their plans, Israel as a nation will lurch dramatically to the right. My support for Israel will remain unshakable, but my questioning of Israeli policies will most likely become much more sharp. Support we will, but question we must. Okay, now, November 8th, second thing, we complete the midterm voting cycle here in the United States. Step 1, become informed. Got that. Step 2 is to vote. I urge all of you who are American citizens to express your will at the ballot box. The stakes are enormously high, too high for us to remain indifferent. Okay. Our Sedra is Lech Lecha, Genesis 12:1 and following. The text is rich to overflowing with well-known stories. Abram is called by God, Lech Lecha. Go forth from your land, your birthplace, your father's home, to the land that I will show you. Abram and Sarai then end up in Egypt, and Abram shows a high level of insensitivity, to say the least insensitivity, in seeking to preserve his own life. Then they, together with Lot and his family, are now back in Canaan. A war is fought and won. God makes a covenantal promise, and Abram joins in that promise through a magical, mystical ceremony, covenant. Abram takes Hagar for a wife. Ishmael is born. A promise is made that Sarai, will bear a child. Next week, we get Sarah's response. She laughs. Yet with all these stories, so much is left out. What was Abram's life like when he was a child? And why did Abram disavow Sarai in Egypt? And how did Canaan actually become the promised land? And who was Melchizedek, king of Salem, called in our text Kohen, hear that? Kohen La'el Elyon, a priest of the Most High, who brought an offering to Abram of bread and wine. First time, sacred ceremony, bread and wine. And by the way, was Salem another name for Jerusalem? How did Ishmael end up with such extravagant promises in our book of Genesis? Such questions threw open wide the gates of midrash and then of scholarly research. The rabbis loved the unfilled gaps in the story of Abram. So what was Abram's really like? Let's take that one. He lived with his father Terah, a gentleman who ran an idol shop. One day when Terah was out, Abram showed himself to be the one who mocked the worship of idols. Step 1 in the Jewish people's march to monotheism. Only problem is, all that is midrash. But can biblical scholarship give us a bit more insight into religion in the Fertile Crescent at the supposed time of Abram? And the answer firmly is maybe. It is likely that Abram's family were moon worshippers. How can we know this? Abram was said to be the son of Terach. Terach, the word, is etymologically related to Yareach, the Hebrew word for moon. Another son of Terach, brother Abram, was Haran. And the family came from Ur of the Chaldees and then moved to the city known as Haran. So Abram's brother was Haran. They lived in the city of Haran after first living in Ur of the Chaldees. Are you still with me? Here's the point. Both Ur and Haran were key centers for the worship of the moon in the Fertile Crescent. There's so much more tantalizing evidence. You know what a ziggurat is, right? Do you remember? Remember last week we talked about the Tower of Babel, and we said really that it's the imagining of a ziggurat that was actually seen by whoever told that story. We in 2022 still have a fabulous archaeological site in Ur called the Great Ziggurat. And that ziggurat was dedicated to, want to guess? The worship of the moon. And what about Terach? Was he a good and loyal moon worshiper who owned an idol shop? In rabbinic imagination. The influence of moon worship didn't disappear from nascent Judaism. Rather, it became absorbed and tamed. Queen Esther, she's not in the book of Genesis, but Queen Esther was named after Ishtar, the daughter of the moon god. Do you remember the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach? You remember those guys? Those names are both derivatives of names given to the moon god. The Assyrians worshipped the moon god Sin, S-I-N, that's what they were called, and the sun god Shamash. The Sin desert in Israel's Negev today is named after the moon god. And the Hebrew word for sun today, Shemesh. The Arabian Peninsula in pre-Islamic times was the setting for widespread worship of the moon god. And we know that there was in fact a Jewish kingdom in part of the Arabian Peninsula in pre-Islamic times. And ancient Egypt had amongst the pantheon of its gods one who was associated with the moon. Crescent moon was the symbol and was part of the concern for fertility among women. The moon became vital in Judaism for shaping the Hebrew calendar. That calendar, our calendar, is a moon calendar, a lunar calendar, with adjustments to make that calendar reset periodically to be in sync with the solar calendar. But at the same time that all this was happening, the rabbis were fighting back against the moon, and so they wove stories that indicated both the sun and the moon are to be subjugated to God. The moon subjugated to the sun and the moon subjugated to God, and they only operated and had agency when God granted them that power. So where are we? We started off by wanting to know more about the background for the biblical stories about Abram, and found that one of the most powerful obstacles to the birth and growth of monotheism was the significant place of the moon and moon worship in the ancient Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Egypt. All places of significant Jewish habitation. The scribes and priests who founded Judaism had the task of fending off, driving out moon worship. But they did that by taming moon worship and giving it a normative role in our tradition. Simple example, we bless each new moon, and well we should. So our forefather Abram, according to both biblical scholarship and the midrashic tradition, emerged from a moon-worshipping world. In a process that we today call syncretism, S-Y-N, syncretism, Judaism over more than 3,000 years absorbed and reconfigured moon worship, grew stronger because of it, but also absorbed and reconfigured many other elements from outside the boundaries of Judaism. A living, dynamic religious tradition cannot hide behind the walls of obscurantism and expect to long survive. That tradition must always seek out the richest, most ennobling of values and of practices, and to find a way to make those values and practices part of that vibrant religion's core. Lech Lecha, God said. Lech Lecha. But don't ever turn your back on the truths that you will meet along the way. Rejection isn't the only path to a better future. Think about that. Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next week after the election when you voted.